What if I told you that the first machine that capitalism ever created wasn't the steam engine or anything like it? It was in fact the human body. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back to our series on Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. This unbelievable book. We are tackling chapter 3 today, which is a pretty short chapter. But there's a lot to talk about with this chapter. We're going to talk today mostly about the mechanization of the human body and the way that this happened over the course of time. This is a chapter that has a lot to do with theory, specifically theory of biopower. So we are dealing with Michel Foucault, and we're also dealing with a couple earlier philosophers, René Descartes and also Thomas Hobbes. These are two philosophers that are looking, philosophers and polymaths. They were also scientists. These are people who are looking at the human body and looking for ways to mechanize it, but kind of in different ways. We're going to get into all of that. Now, before we start into kind of the meat and potatoes of this video, I do want to say really quickly that if you're just jumping into this here on this video, I recommend that you check out the first 2 chapters. I have videos up on both of those, but you actually don't need to. This is, if you're just going to jump in anywhere, this is kind of a perfect place to jump in. This is where Federici starts an analysis that's a little bit divorced from the first 2 chapters that are a lot more about history. So if you want the history, I think it helps, but you can also just jump right in here. Now, as always, please like, share, subscribe. You can check out the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. There's a lot more stuff over there that you can access, and all of this main feed stuff where we talk about really awesome leftist books is out there as well. So please do check that out. And if you're already a subscriber on Patreon, thank you so much. You make this whole thing work. I love you all very much. Now, to break down this video, I'm going to separate this into 3 sections. We're going to talk about this Cartesian duality, mind and body, and then we're going to talk about magic. What is magic? What does magic mean for this kind of medieval going into the Enlightenment period? And then we're going to close out with the Age of Reason, which is what I'm choosing to call the attack on the body by the forces of capitalism. This is a really, really fascinating chapter. And we're structuring it like this. This departs a little bit from the structure that Federici herself uses in this chapter. But ultimately, I think this is a very approachable chapter. This is a chapter that is the shortest in the book, and it's also one of the most fascinating because we're talking about literally the human body and how the human body experiences the forces of capitalism. So let's jump right in and talk about mind and body. Now, throughout a lot of human thought, there has been elements of this dualism. Dualism splitting the body from the mind, or sometimes you get versions of this that are kind of the material and the soul. You get various forms of this. It's all very much formalized with the work of René Descartes. Descartes has the famous cogito ergo sum formulation for human thought. That is, I think, therefore I am. And from that, you can kind of get this idea that maybe we can separate the human mind from the body. Federici interprets this through the lens of William Shakespeare. Again, this is kind of the central metaphor for this entire book, Caliban and the Witch. Caliban, the character in The Tempest, embodies the body. He embodies everything that we'll come to learn is considered kind of filthy, as of the earth. And then contrasted with Caliban, you have Ariel, who is kind of ethereal, the spiritual mind side of things. And then on top of both of them, controlling both of them, you have Prospero. And Silvia Federici tells us that Prospero is kind of the ideal man coming out of the medieval period. And specifically through the work of people like René Descartes. Descartes has this treatise of man, which becomes kind of an anatomy handbook. It is a work of philosophy, but Descartes is out there vivisecting and dissecting and studying human and animal anatomy to come to this idea of how can we subjugate the human body to the mind. So think about it this way. Prospero is actually a perfect example of this whole idea. Prospero, this sorcerer who is shipwrecked on the island and must master both the spiritual and the material elements under his control. He's the perfect example because he has to sort of elevate his own mental faculties. He has to prioritize reason, but he can't really get rid of the body. The body, Caliban, is something to be mastered, something to be subjugated, something to be dominated. And in other words, Federici is telling us this is the point in time where all of a sudden, you have thinkers across Europe saying, how do we prioritize reason? How can we create ideal human beings who can use their mental faculties and control the body? And Federici leans on an argument from Michel Foucault that the body had to be disciplined for capitalism to form. Federici is very interested in this chapter in the work of Descartes and Hobbes, of course, but she says this is much wider. This is a bourgeoisie, this is the burgeoning bourgeoisie, right? This is the early days of capitalism. This is a bourgeoisie obsession with how can we understand the human body and control it. Mechanized, in other words, mechanical philosophy. I want to read this quote from the book. This is page 148 in the Penguin. In mechanical philosophy, we perceive a new bourgeois spirit that calculates, classifies, makes distinctions, and degrades the body only in order to rationalize its faculties, aiming not just at intensifying its subjection, but at maximizing its social utility. These are Federici's words. She is also kind of paraphrasing Michel Foucault in this specific part, but this gives you an idea of what exactly she means when she talks about mechanical philosophy. All of a sudden, you have this eruption of sentiment in Europe that the body itself, or at least the human individual, is a constant battlefield, a battle between higher reason and lower animal instincts. This is something that Karl Marx also picks up on, right? The fact that we are self-estranged by our labor. Federici raises a lot of really interesting points. One of them is that, for example, in the labor process, we are kind of divorced from any kind of human time. Our human or magical or bodily conceptions of time are all subjugated to the needs of the workday, the work hour. This is actually something that we see just in our normal lives, right? This is very much in tune with the way that we now subjugate our entire lives to the needs of the workday. Federici also points to a new form of what can be called political arithmetic. This is kind of demography and statistics, right? The need to categorize and calculate and figure out the human individual by sorting them into different things. If we can just understand humanity, we can control humanity. The goal here is to neutralize passions, to create kind of the perfect little worker that can go and work in the system. And this leads to two interesting and sort of competing ideas that arrive around the same time. You get René Descartes, who we've talked about already, and Descartes says, well, you must master your animalistic side. You must elevate reason and push down the animal within you. Hobbes, however, Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, takes another and slightly more radical tack, and it's something that is not as popular at the time, but he says, listen, we actually can't resist our animalistic urges. We are compelled by our biology to be greedy and self-serving and to attack others and stab each other in the back for personal gain. And so we need to submit ourselves to the control of an all-powerful state. This is Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan idea. Now, both in their way are reducing the human body to something that is fit for the capitalist work ethic, but you can see why there is such a division between these two views. The view that ends up prevailing is Descartes' view, the sort of Enlightenment view, the idea that, well, if we can just elevate the human mind and reduce our animal instincts, then we can conquer what it means to be human. That's essentially what that is. So the bourgeois ethic becomes a process of reforming the body. And this is, again, the early days of biopower. We are trying to fit life rhythms into the rhythms of the workplace, the rhythms of the factory, the rhythms of what capitalism requires of us. But let's leave this sort of mind and body dualism on the back burner for a second, and let's turn to the idea of magic, because the prevailing notion before this was that there is magic in the world, that there are sort of magical conditions that one can access through certain rituals or certain understandings of things or certain herbal practices. Whatever it is, there are many different ways to access magic, but magic exists. Magic, however, is a threat to the emerging capitalist class. So in these early pre-capitalist societies, there's an understanding of the body as a receptacle of magical power. This is not something animalistic. The division isn't there. Really, what there is an understanding that the body and our connection with the material world is a connection to the animistic little gods that are out there in nature, right? The personification of Earth as a living being that we are connected to. Magic is seen as a legitimate way of seeing and shaping the world around us, the literal, physical, material conditions. Also, and this is very important, magic is seen as a form of power. It's also a form of power that can get you access to things without having to work for them, right? If you can cast the right spell, you won't have to work for that thing, you can just receive it. But obviously, the capitalist class can't accept this as an idea, and they can't accept that people could accept this. Going back to that idea of work time, or the capitalist time, magic is also incompatible with this idea. Why show up at the office and do the same thing every single day if some days are lucky days and other days are unlucky days? That's another argument that Silvia Federici puts forward. Now, Federici, and this is where I think it's worth extending our analysis of Federici ourselves a little bit. Federici takes the position that we don't really need to investigate whether or not magic was actually powerful, whether it actually did anything in the first place. And I think that we can extend this a little bit. This is something that we talked about when we talked about the ecology of freedom with Murray Bookchin. Because Murray Bookchin in that book, and if you haven't seen the series, I recommend you check it out because it was an absolute blast to do that series. But Murray Bookchin in the ecology of freedom makes this argument for a type of considered animism. This kind of let us look at the natural world around us and have a degree of humility for the things that we cannot understand. Reason, the way that we currently understand and lay out the scientific method, will only take us so far. I absolutely love this idea of humility. I think a lot of people are very quick to reach for the argument that if there is no scientific explanation for something, that something cannot be true or it cannot exist. And I think that that is a very sad way to live your life, and it's also a completely useless way to live your life. There are tons of things out there that we just don't have a scientific explanation for. The basic building blocks of our lives, the subatomic particles that we know about, we don't know if they are strings or particles or both. It is a vast and mysterious universe, and the argument for humility is, I think, very powerful. Now, does this mean that we should go and cast some spells like they did in the medieval period? Maybe you can if you want. I probably won't myself. I also think that one of the things that Bookchin as well says about the belief in Gaia specifically, and we can extend this to things like astrology, for example. A lot of this is just to sell you stuff. And I don't mean to come down so hard because I know people take a lot of comfort in these ideas, but if it is sort of a mystical practice that is being used to sell things, then I see very little value in that. However, I see a lot of value in the idea of standing back and saying, yeah, we don't know. That, to me, is very powerful. Either way, this concept of magic, right? There is magic in the world. There is magic in the body. There is magic that we can access. There is magic as a center of early proletarian power that we could potentially access. That has to be crushed by the dominant capitalist class. And so the peak of the age of reason is an attack on magical practices. Now, Federici is going to go much further into this idea as we go along, because we are about to enter the European witch hunt. And this is when capitalism and the elites and the dominant power groups and the clergy start to attack witches. This is when they say, okay, these receptacles of magical power, they have to go. And the attack on witches is an attack on women, and it is also an attack on the body, and the body as a receptacle of magical power. And so you get many huge thinkers and Enlightenment figures that support this absolutely brutal crackdown on magical practices, because this belief in magic threatens the very underpinnings of the bourgeoisie ethic, and that is to destroy the body and destroy the worker. Or if not destroy, I should say, to control the body. So now let's talk about the age of reason. What the age of reason actually is an all-out attack on the bodies of workers so that they can be controlled. What Federici says here is that the goal of this entire state apparatus that throws all of its energy behind it is to convert individual power into labor power. Now, workers, she says, didn't immediately accept just wage labor, right? These are people who used to work under their own means often on commons or on their own farms to support themselves. And then when you started to push them off the commons, when you had this enclosure thing that we talked about last week, when you had enclosure and people pushed into the towns, they didn't just go and accept wage labor. A lot of them preferred to become wandering vagabonds, some sort of beggars on the street. So to do that, you have the passage of things that were referred to in England as the bloody laws. These are all there to prevent vagabondage and to punish the sort of informal life and the errant workers. Anybody who isn't part of the capital machinery gets chewed up by the legal system. And it's absolutely brutal. I mean, in England, and she points this out, during the reign of Henry VIII, 72,000 people over the 38 years that his reign encompassed were executed. You also had a social side to this as well. It's not just literally punishing the workers that aren't taking place. It's also cracking down on areas and places where workers could gather together and be workers apart from the capitalist system. So you have things like taverns and games and public baths that are banned. You have nakedness being punished. You also have swearing and cursing being criminalized. And of course, we know various forms of sexual intercourse and sexuality also heavily penalized and criminalized. And all of this to crack down and control the human body. Remember that all of this is just an effort to do just that. And you have the definition of the body as something that is evil, as something that is sinful, as something that is filthy. Federici talks about a focus on excrement in the later half of the 17th century. This is something that people are obsessed with now. The body, which used to be something that was a receptacle of magical power, something that was connected to the earth. Now we see the body as something that produces waste and excrement. It is filthy and it must be tamed. And so reform is not just moral, it's economic. It's an effort to tame workers and discipline the bodies of those workers. What we're aiming to do at the end of all of this is to produce docile and efficient workers. And here's the thing. If you did join me on our trip through the ecology of freedom with Murray Bookchin, you may see a lot of overlap between the disciplining of the human body and the disciplining of nature. There is a lot of crossover here because the thought is, if you can control the human body and if you can master nature, if you can understand the mechanics that make human beings do what they do, and if you can understand and categorize the natural world and understand what it does, then you can command it. And if you can command it, you can create something with it. Human civilization is being defined away from the human body, our literal material human body, and from nature, the natural world that we all exist in, that we are all a part of, whether we like it or not. And what we are left with is something that I think is Federici's kind of lasting contribution to this. It's something that when I read this book for the first time, I came away and continued to think about for a long time after that. And that's the division or the separation between the magical body, the understanding of the body as magical, and the mechanical body. And you can see a very clear trend over time from the magical body to the mechanical body. And now you see it everywhere around us all the time. It is just efforts to control and to tame and to mechanize the human body. Everything from the sort of biohacking side of YouTube to the Neuralink implants that Elon Musk is working on right now, we are literally becoming more automaton, literally more machine-like. And that is a really clear and a powerful insight that comes straight from this book. I absolutely love this chapter because it leaves us with that idea. And I think as soon as you understand that idea and internalize that idea and come to terms with the realities of biopower and what this looks like, you start seeing it everywhere. Anyway, that's where we'll leave it. I know this has been kind of a shorter video today, but the implications, I think, are much bigger. So let me know what you think about all of this. Do you agree with my conclusions on kind of the difference between the magical body and the mechanical body? Is there anything that we can do in our ordinary lives to imbue ourselves with what Murray Bookchin would call sort of the animistic way of looking at nature, or what Federici might refer to as restoring the magical sensibilities of the body? Is there anything that we can do to do that in our ordinary daily lives? I want to hear. And I also want to draw your attention to an essay that Federici wrote much later in praise of the dancing body, which echoes this kind of sentiment and talks a little bit more about the mechanization of humanity. It's a brilliant essay. I recommend that you read it in full. I will link it everywhere I can think to link it. And check it out. And I want to leave you with just the final paragraph here because I think it's important. Federici says, our bodies have reasons that we need to learn, rediscover, reinvent. We need to listen to their language as the path to our health and healing, as we need to listen to the language and rhythms of the natural world as the path to health and healing of the earth. Since the power to be affected and to affect, to be moved and move, a capacity which is indestructible, exhausted only with death, is constitutive of the body, there is an immanent politics residing in it, the capacity to transform itself, others, and change the world. And a little earlier in the essay, just because I absolutely love this line, she says, I have come to believe that there is a philosophy in dancing, for dance mimics the processes by which we relate to the world, connect with other bodies, transform ourselves and the space around us. But that is just the genius of Silvia Federici. We will be back next week, and that is when we start getting into the witch hunt, the great witch hunt of Europe. So as always, let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.